All right, guys, we are picking back up this morning here, still going on our example with our application to kind of work with a storefront sort of problem. So multiple store owners and the stores they run and customers to interact with them. So the last couple times we've been working on just some of the basic functions to deal with the CSV files that we are going to be using for the data here in our example. And so first we had written a function that basically reads in a specific row based on the ID of the customer that we're using to track them. And then we had written another function here that took in the ID of a customer and then the name of a field to update and then the new value for that field. And based on those things, this function actually updated the value of whatever it was that the field had. So what I think I'm going to have us do this morning is organize a lot of the work that we still need to do here, just so that you can make progress without me. And so I know part of the intent of this, if you remember back, was to get a sense of where you are in terms of your speed and your comfort with some of the concepts that we've gone over, so that I can judge if I think we're ready to move on. So I've gotten some idea still, but at the same time, just for time efficiency's sake, if we only limit the progress that we make here to time when we're truly sitting in the same place together, well, then it's going to go a lot slower, right? And so that's probably not the best for you, not the best for me either. So I will this morning try to lay out some of what we think we need to do remaining, and then you can be working on that even when I'm not around. And whenever we meet, I'll be able to see where you are when we are together, but this will be for when we're not. So you remember back, I had mentioned that, so I'm going to make a comment here for that we still start. So we've written, I think we should probably rename these. So this function here that we've written specifically deals with a customer, right? So this file here that we've called example, how about we actually rename this file to be customers, right? We're going to rename this file to be customers. This will be the CSV file where we store our customers. So then the file name here needs to change, and the file name down here needs to change. Okay, that should make good sense. And then this one, we're going to have be customer record all the way through. And then this one, we're also going to put customer in the name. So if I'm doing this, what do you think another thing that we're going to do is then? Why would I bother to go and add customer specifically to the name of these functions here?
Because we're dealing with multiple types of users. We also have store owners. Yes.
Well, basically where I was going with this was we just defined operations that read and update individual customer records. And we've defined at least 2 or 3 other sorts of data that we're going to have to deal with. So if we do this for customer records, we're probably going to need to do that for the other kinds of records too, right? Unless we only update customers for some reason in our database, or not our database, our data store that we're using right now. Well, we're probably going to do more than just that, right? So what I'm going to have us do is finish off one completely before we go pick up another one. So right now we just redefine the functions to have customer in the name. And you see these things are dealing with the customers file. So we have a read and a update here. And if you remember, So I mentioned that we have this idea of CRUD operations. So create, read, update, and delete are basic operations that you do to data, right? Now, commonly in web applications, you'll interact with these things. You'll have a web application somewhere that lets you do these things over HTTP requests. But we're not necessarily writing a web app here, but the same sort of basic idea applies. Create, read, update, delete. And so right now we have done read and update, which means we still need to do create and delete. After you have done the CRUD operations here, customers, then I think we should make example data files for stores and what else? Store owners, right? And then we'll want to make CRUD operations those fields too. Stores, store owners. I think we should actually have another one called product. I'll explain that in a second. So if we have at least 3 other types of things, well, you see that our application is going to get quite a bit bigger pretty fast, right? Because suddenly we're going to need operations to manage each one of these things here. You following so far?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So this right here, even before we've written a line of the code to actually do the application loop, well, all of this stuff will be necessary once we start defining things that the user can do. So if we do this, we finish customer, you have an example that way of all of the CRUD operations for a data field. Then we come up with example data for the other sorts of things that our application will deal with. Then we make the CRUD operations for those fields too. So all in all, it looks like here we're going to have 4 types of data files here that we're using to track things. So that means that we're going to have 4 times 4 is 16 functions right off the bat just to process all of these files.
Okay. We will essentially have the same functions for all of them.
They will be very similar, except the file names will be different and the field names will be different here, but the same structure for how we go about doing the operations, the structure will match. Okay, so we're just coming out with a plan to tackle the work. So at some point, we're going to want to make the main program loop, right? And so that will have some parts. We're going to want to add a login. So user must provide name. Right, so before they can do things, they log in, and then let's see. So what sorts of things do you think? Let's come at this from the perspective of store owners, and then from the perspective of customers. So what kinds of things do you think store owners should be able to do?
They should be able to put products on, like add products to
Add
the
products to store inventory, right?
yes. They should be able to see how much money has come into the store, right? Purchases.
So like view
Store balance of something. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't need to make it excessively complicated at the very beginning. So I think those two things are pretty decent. So from the perspective of customers, they should like be able to buy a product, right?
Yes, they should be able to see products and
right. So able to and that should actually be true of both kinds of people, right? Regardless of if you're a store owner or a customer, you want to be able to see what products the store has, right?
yeah.
And actually, I think we should change this to one or more products, right? Because in the real world, when you buy something, it's not like you have to buy things one at a time, right? You can buy just one thing, but you can also buy multiple things at the same time. And say also, since we're working with this idea of counts here, they should be able to deposit more money, right? Into their account for now. Do you have other things? I don't think so. I think that's most of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so in a general sense, so let's also talk about admin functions. So both kinds of users will be able to see and update their information in the system, right? Okay. What else?
Or
like change their password.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it necessary to add being able to delete their account or something like that?
Yeah, and that's why we would implement delete. So so store owners should be able to delete their store, right? They go out of business or whatever. Trying to think if we're missing more things here. Okay, so let's talk about so we should not show our data IDs to users at any time. So I've kind of been lax about that when we were doing things initially here, but we really shouldn't have ID showing up in what we actually show to the user. So this would be like the return of read here. Right now, we actually are grabbing ID. We really wouldn't want to, probably.
Okay.
We should not show data IDs to users at any time. No user should be able to see the info of other users. Right? Only the owner of the store should not the product. All right, so I think that's an okay first pass. I mean, as you can see, it's starting to get to be a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, don't be overwhelmed. We didn't pick a super small example here. You know, we could have done something a lot easier, but the good news is that what we're building out here, it will probably take us a little bit. It'll be good practice, and it will give you a sense of designing kind of an application that is more similar to something that might actually be used in the real world. You know, albeit somewhat smaller scale, but still. So, all right. So something that's probably pretty overwhelming in this is, well, okay, so we have a lot of things to do, right? Where do we even start? And I would encourage you to just not worry about that question so much, because guess what? You're going to have to do all of it anyway, right? So this comes up at work a fair bit, especially with newer people, is their eyes will just glaze over because we have so much stuff, so many requirements we have to meet, so many things we have to do. And then they just don't even know how to make heads or tails of all of the things before us. And the thing is, if we have to do all of it anyway, there probably are some better and worse places to start because some of these things are dependent on other ones, right? But you'll kind of figure that out as you go, right? And so, you know, like there are advantages to planning a little bit more up front, but at the same time, you're not going to be doomed if you just kind of pick a place and you start. And once you get a bit more experience under your belt, you'll have a better idea of just where to start tackling things as general procedure. But I would encourage you to just not worry about it too much for a while, because you'll be fine, you know, no matter where you are, because you have to do it all anyway. And so it's not something that you should be overly concerned about doing everything in the right order, because as long as you meet the requirements, the customer is not going to care what order you do it in. They just want their application to work, right? And different people are different. So what seems easier in the head of one person might seem harder to someone else. Now, of course, most of the time in the real world, you'll be developing on teams of people, so it won't just be you. And so hopefully what makes sense to you also makes sense to other people, because if it doesn't, well, then that's harder because you'll have to review each other's code and stuff. Okay, so this is where we are here. Part of the question then is, what should we do when I'm here and we have sort of an easier ability to get you unstuck as we work versus when I'm not here? So initially, I would say we should try to finish the CRUD operations for sure. And then I think we should try to make example data files for all of the other things, because that way the rest of it will just be figuring out basically how to duplicate what we've done on a lot of other things, right? So let's clean up the security of some of this a little bit. So I'm going to go kind of fast here. I'm sure you'd be able to do this as well. Give it enough time. So we'd used in this second update function somewhat different format than we had in the first one. If you see here, we just made a normal reader from the CSV package here, right? And then we had to index into it specifically using these number indices, which doesn't mean very much to us. Like if I were to come back and look at this later, it wouldn't, you know, like I would have a harder time understanding why am I grabbing like the first thing or the second thing or whatever. So we're going to go through and grab the field names like this still. Okay, so when we do that, we're actually probably not going to display the ID or the password to the user, because if you think about most websites security wise, even when you go to update your password, the website's not going to tell you what your password is, right? It's going to make you re-enter your password and then enter a new one. So we don't actually really need that in the read. So the only customer information that we actually really want to show here is going to be so we're going to have name and then that the person has. This will be what we return back. And so for now, we can just leave this. As returning those two things. Eventually, we'll probably want to come up with when we're grabbing this data, how are we going to display it? So how I think it kind of makes sense is the user will log in, and then what will be is like, hello, username, you have blank dollars at the moment or something like that, right? So they know what their balance is. That's probably how we'll use it eventually. But the changes I just made, well, we cleaned this up. We made it simpler. We removed some of the stuff security-wise that we're probably not going to need there. And then you can see that now the code's a little bit cleaner, and eventually we'll go back and use the return values that we think we actually need. Okay, so down here, security-wise, we said ID. It's not really something we want to let the user update, right? This one, if customer ID is equal to row ID, so the validation on the field here, so I think it makes sense for us to do another check here. So we don't want to let them update ID, right? But we also kind of want this code to be general enough so that we don't like specifically check just these fields here. Because if we're going to have to copy the general format of this function like 4 times, we kind of want to write the function in such a way that we can like extend it to multiple different things. So rather than checking, is the thing a name or a password or cache, right, that they would want to update, it's actually better to check, is the thing not ID? Do you understand what I just said? Because if we check, is it this or this or this, well, what happens when suddenly now we're dealing with stores, and stores don't have names and passwords. So, like we're going to have to change things there. Whereas if we say not ID, well, then we don't have to worry about, like that. So if customer ID is equal to row ID, and so we're going to add another thing to this logical check, and we're going to say if field is not equal to what?
The field is not equal to row. No, not field. Okay, not ID, of course.
Not equal to ID, right?
ID.
So we don't want to let them update ID. Now, eventually, what do you think we should do? So right now, we're just not going to let them do it. But are we throwing an exception or something here? Right now, we're not, right? But eventually, we probably want to, until the user, you cannot update ID or something. Or in fact, what might even make more sense right now is why would we even let the user enter arbitrary things here? See, we did it because it saves us time. We can make the code kind of reusable, right? So rather than having one function called update customer name and update customer password and update customer cache, right? You see how we combined all 3 of those things into one method because of this thing right here. We don't care what the name or the value is. And this is one of the powerful things about Python is it lets you get away. You can combine things with multiple data types into the same function, and it makes it kind of clean like this. However, because in something like Java or C#, it's a strongly typed language, this is a string, this is a string, this is a number. It's not a string, right? It's probably a floating point number, a double, because dollars can have decimal values. So in those programming languages, you could not actually do what we're doing here and saying, regardless of what the thing is, I want to reassign it to the new value because they have different data types. But in Python, you can't. But where I'm going with this is that we wrote one function to actually update any one of these three things because it's easier for us to maintain rather than maintaining three separate functions to do these things. Because what happens if suddenly in the future, we don't just have 3 fields? What happens if we have like 15? So I work in an enterprise level. Mostly we do business apps on my team. And so there are some of the main fields for our customers' data for one of their big objects has maybe 35, 40 fields on it. Now, database design wise, sometimes it's best to split the table and then store things in separate tables and combine it all. However, we're still talking an enormous number of fields, right? So a lot of things you have to maintain. And so one of the beautiful things about Python here is the flexibility it gives you to kind of roll some of that stuff into the same function here. Because update, this row right here is really the only thing that does the update. Everything else is just kind of boilerplate. Like we have to open the file and then we have to write, every row, and then we have to move the temporary file back to the other one that we're overwriting, right? But none of that really deals with the actual updating thing so much, right? It's that right there. Okay, where was I going with all this? Right, so we shouldn't let them update ID. We're gonna check the security, and eventually we should come back and we should throw an exception if they try to, and then give them an error message, right? But for now, this is fine. All right, so that is read and update, more cleaned up now. So let's do delete next. So remember how I said delete was going to be pretty simple, or not simple, pretty similar.
Similar, yes.
Right. Okay, so everything. Let's go through line by line and see if we need to change something. So do we need a field and a value if we're just going to delete this?
Field and the value. We don't need a value, do we? No, we don't need it.
Okay. Do we need a field?
If we're going to delete one.
So the reason why we needed a field of what was because we were changing one specific thing relating to the person, but we're not changing one thing anymore. This one's all or nothing. Either we're going to delete a person or we're not. So we don't actually need field.
Okay.
We just need to know which person we ought to delete. Okay. So field names aren't changing, right? Same stuff. Okay. Still going to be opening the customer file, still going to need the temporary file to overwrite, still going to have the reader and the writer. None of that's changing. Still going to go through all the rows in the reader. If customer ID equals ID, well, we don't have field anymore, so that goes away, right?
Yes.
So right now, before we were updating the value in that row, and right here, we can make a single change. If customer ID equals row ID, and we want to delete the customer. Do you remember when we talked about loops and we talked about things like break and continue?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so at a high level, the logic of what we want to do here is for every row in the reader, as long as customer ID is not equal to the ID of the person we want to delete, we want to write that row to the new output file. But if the customer ID is equal, we want to just not do anything and we want to jump to the next person. So what keyword lets us do that?
If we want to jump to the next person, we would continue.
Continue, right.
Yes, continue.
All right, so then what this code does is for each row in the reader, it checks if the customer ID is equal to the ID that we're passing in. And if it is, we're just going to skip that one. So we're going to be writing every single row to the output file except the row where the customer ID matches, right? And conceptually, that means that once we finish this operation, the file that we've now made has every row except the one that we said we wanted to delete. Does that sound like delete to you, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you see, we copy pasted this code. It looks scary. Like we wrote, like 15 lines of code or whatever, but how long did it take us to write that? Like 15 seconds, right? Eventually, once you know kind of what you need to change and what all of the code is doing, you can get away with actually copy and pasting quite a bit. This is one of the secret, like one of the secret, what do I call it? Technique, not even a secret, it's open secret. They in college, and again, this is me going to go harp on how silly it is the way that a lot of academic programming classes teach you how to code. They discourage copy pasting. Like you can't copy paste code off the internet or use libraries or whatever, because you need to learn how to do it so that you learn, right? The problem is that in the real world, you're highly incentivized to copy paste as much as you possibly can. So something that happens a lot on my team, we have a lot of things like this where we have pretty similar fields. In fact, if you set up your project well, we'll get to generics a little bit later. You should try to minimize the amount of code that you need to copy paste as much as possible. You remember we talked about that, right? Don't repeat yourself. If you can figure out a way to reuse code rather than maintaining code that's very similar in multiple places in your project, that will make your project much more maintainable. But in any case, sometimes you can't for reasons and stuff. I'm not going to get much more specific than that. But at the very least, even though the fields here might be a little bit different, when we go and we make these functions, I'll give you an example of what I mean here in a second. When we go through and we make the functions for the other ones, they're not going to be that different. I mean, some stuff's going to change about like which file we open and things like that. Now, I'll give you a hint, actually. I will have us make one function where we do it completely different. I'm actually going to contradict myself here. I thought maybe we make a lot of functions. I think it would be good practice for us to see if we can make one completely generic the very first time we do it.
Okay.
So I think we actually have enough information that we should be able to. So if we go through, like, let's take the update method here, right? So things that are going to be specific to a field, right? Field names. This depends on which one we have. Boy, look at me not being consistent with the, I mean, it doesn't really matter, but it's going to annoy me. So field names depends on which kind of record we're dealing with. The file name depends on which kind of record, right? Because customers.csv is going to be different than stores.csv and store owners and products, right? And that line doesn't, that's our temp file. This line doesn't, this line doesn't. This one doesn't. This one doesn't. This one's a little trickier, right? We'll get to that. That's harder. So right now it looks like we're hard coding it, right? And then this depends on the file name too. So we definitely have some stuff that depends, but if we make this thing a variable that's passed in, and then this thing a variable that's passed in, and then wave our hands at this and say it's possible, because it is, because you see how we have everything we need to do this. Well, then it looks like we could actually make this function able to be used for multiple things, right? So I'll show you what I mean. I'm not sure if we'll have time this morning, but let's try to finish the rest of the operations for a single one, and then we'll see if we can use the same, idea here for like extending it for all of the things that we're going to deal with. Okay, so now we have read, update, and delete. The last one that we have to do is add. So Create customer record. Okay. So for now, we know what information are we going to need to give a user, or sorry, not give a user, what information will a user need to give us to be able to register?
We'll need the name, we'll need a password. And do they need to give cash or that?
Well, I mean, for now, eventually we don't want to just let a person say how much money they have. Conceptually view this as they need to deposit money in their account, right? It's like they're not going to say they have money. Conceptually, we should view it as they're making a deposit in their store account to be able to buy things. Okay. So let's see. So right here, we have to go through the whole file for these, for delete and update. But for this method here on create, let's see if we can, I mean, remember how I mentioned that the fastest thing is just to look on the internet, right? So how can I append a row CSV Python, right? Okay, first link we're clicking here. Okay, so it says make a list, and then might give us the example. Aha, another open. This time we're going to open with a flag that has an A in it. So if we look at the other ones, we've opened this file with an R, that's for reading. This file with a W, that's for writing. And you see how now we have a different flag. This one's an A. That stands for appending. Following so far?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So let's just copy this. We're going to change stuff here. Okay, and then we'll get the indentation right. Let's delete all the comments because it's good for us to figure it out. It's not necessary for using with. I don't know why they have that. Shame on them. Define name writer. Because they use specific import there. Okay. So this needs to become customers, right? Customers.csv. Rather than list data here, we're going to make a list and we're going to call it customer data. So, now we need to figure out how to set the ID. For now, let's do the rest of it. So inside this list, we'll use the name that they gave us, and then we'll use the password that they gave us, and then now to save us a bug later, I'm going to call that up front because the cache that they give us is probably going to be a number. But when we're writing to the file here, actually, I don't know how smart the CSV thing is. It might handle it. I'm not sure actually. But now the question is, how do we get the ID that we're going to want to provide? So the ID needs to be our unique identifier in our system to identify the user. And the reason why we don't just use name, which would kind of be an obvious choice here, is that what happens if the name isn't unique? What happens if the password isn't unique too? Can't use password to uniquely identify someone, because what happens if more than one person just randomly, for whatever stroke of chance, uses the same password? So you could say name and password compositely, but a lot of the time it's just cleaner concept-wise to just give people an ID, a numerical ID that represents them in the database.
Okay.
So one way we could do this is, so tricky thing is that right now in our data file, we might add 10 people and then 2 of them might get deleted. And then we could try to reuse the IDs that were previously used, but that's confusing. And actually that's generally considered bad practice. It's not something that we're going to do in this application because we don't want it to get too complicated. But in most business contexts, at least when you work in the government sphere, I don't know as much about private industry and stuff, but we have a lot of security requirements relating to logging operations that happened on the data. So like so-called audit logs. So if someone, especially in financial systems, if someone like deleted money from the system or added money to the system, you want a record of that transaction that happened, so that if like an audit person comes in the future and says, "Where'd this money go?" We have our government budget, and we gave you guys this money. Where'd it go? Like someone in the application can say, "Well, on such and such day at such and such time, so and so did this, and that's where the money went." Right? For that reason, a lot of systems, I don't want to get too off topic here, but a lot of systems don't actually delete data completely, a so-called hard delete, get rid of the data in the system. What they do is they just make it inaccessible. They set a flag on the data, like is active equals false or whatever. So the data, once it ends up in the system, the data actually never truly goes away. And I'm bringing all this up just because it might be tempting to think that we reuse IDs for rows that have been deleted. Right now, we're not soft deleting data, and we're not setting up auditing because it's kind of complicated, and it just muddies the waters. I'm basically trying to wave my hand at you and say, don't reuse IDs, just don't. Because integers can have billions of possible values, so you're not going to run into any problems in the real world if you just always, anytime you add a new one, basically use a new ID, not one that's already been used. That's what I'm saying. Because of reasons and stuff, and along the lines of what I just mentioned.
Yes.
Okay, so that's all well and good. We might want to think about how are we going to handle this. I mean, I'm thinking I have to think about how to handle this as well. So ordinarily, databases would handle this automatically. That's one of the nice things about using databases. But we're going through pain and suffering doing it with CSV files, more or less just so that you can properly appreciate how nice databases are once we get there. I'm trying not to lead us into a path that would be considered very bad practice too. Well, we could add another. We could add another something in our application to keep track of the last ID used in each table, right? So maybe we'll do that for now. Just since we're doing with CSV files here, we'll do, what should we call this table? Yeah, well, I'm just trying to, I mean, this is like an application internal table. This is not something that like users will ever see or interact with. This is something that we're using in our own application. So maybe we'll call it like, my brain is not very creative here in the morning. Let's call it metadata, or applications metadata. Oops, and it should make that a CSV file. Okay. Data, CSV. Okay, so for each one, we're going to give the name of the table, and then we're going to give the max ID value, right? So we have customers, probably call this one store owners. Got to pick our table names here. Store owners. We're going to start all of the things out at one. Stores. You see how I'm laying this file out? For all of our tables, we're going to store a row in this one here that contains the name of the table and then the maximum ID value used in that table. Okay, maybe metadata isn't the best name. Maybe we really will just, oops, not delete, rename. Maybe we really will just call this database ID, right? I don't actually know if this would be considered good practice in the real world. In the real world, when you use a database, the database system itself will track this. It will automatically handle IDs for you, so you don't have to. But we're not using a database, so we have to do it. Okay, so if we go back to our main file here, then based on that assumption, we are going to need to actually read in a value from this other file too, aren't we? Because to create a new customer record, we want to create a new customer record that has a value 1 greater than the one currently in this table here. Okay, so here for customers, we know that we are going to need to open basically something to read. So similar to this, we're going to need to open a file for reading, and then we're going to need to grab a value. So no, we'll just copy the whole thing. So what we want to do is we want to get the like new ID. We're going to start it out with it 0, right? And then we want to set the value of new ID by reading in the table name and these are the values of database ID tracking.csv, right? You following so far? I want you to take a second to read through what I just wrote and see if that makes sense to you. All
right.
Let me know when you think you've skimmed it over.
Okay. Okay. So so you said new ID is equal to max ID.
This.
Okay. So there's no incrementing happening.
Yeah. I was about to say, I was going to see if you're going to catch this or not.
Okay.
After we do this, we need to actually make the new max ID one greater than it was, right? Because we're adding a new record here. So.
Okay.
So to do that, really what we're going to need to do is use a writer as well, right? And we're going to have to do more this business. What wasn't it like? Oh, indentation. Okay, so now we need to increment, right? Actually, we need to go through and do So how are we going to increment what we have right here? So I'll give you a hint. This line actually isn't right either. Because max ID represents the greatest ID that we've used so far. That means that that ID already exists in the database, right?
That's actually what I was wondering about.
Yeah.
Okay. So we should be doing new IDs, max ID plus 1 or
okay.
Something.
Well, I can tell you out of programming experience that this won't work because this thing right here is a string, right?
Oh,
and
right.
So the first thing that we're going to have to do is, I actually forget. Different languages do casting differently. So Python turn string number how to cast a string in Python. That's what we're looking for. Data types. Okay. So there's just an int function. See, in C# we have a function called try_int that we would use for that, or int.tryparse. But here we can just do that. And then here we would do new ID, except now we need to make it back into a string, right? Does that make sense? All right. So To go through this code, all this code here is dealing with keeping track of our database ID stuff. Okay, so that we're going to open the, except this one should not be customers. This should be ID. We're going to open our database ID tracking file, and the temp file that we're using as we write over things. So for each row in the database ID tracking file, we're going to get the name of the table and the max ID that that table is using. If the table name is customers here, we're gonna get the max ID that the customers table is currently using and add one to it, and that's going to be the new ID that we'll use. And then we're going to update the table to use this new max ID value. And then for every time for each row in the file, we're going to write to there. We're not going to get rid of anything as we do this. So then once we get back down here, now this now we are going to make a data array here that has all of the information that we need to do to insert a new customer. We can open the customers table in the appending mode. And what have we called? Calling it. All right. So having made our list here of customer data, ID, name, password, and cache. Now we're going to open up the customers table in the append mode, and then we're going to, we actually need the new line. I don't think we need the new line there. Writer.object was writer, and then now let's now I haven't run this, so I'm not actually sure if it will work, but I think it will work. All right, so before I go today, so that you have things to work on, let's make table files here for all of the other fields, store owners, CSV, and then CSV, and okay, so customers, we decided had the field ID, and then name, and then and store owner still have an ID, name, password, right? Trying to recall actually exactly what we said store owners had. ID, name, password, assets.
Yes, assets.
Assets and liabilities. Okay, so customers just have purchase and cash, but stores have assets and liabilities. Okay. And we have stores which have so a store owner, do you think they can have more than one store?
Yes, they could. They could have more than one.
So a store has a store owner, right? So we need to store the ID of a different store owner in the store. Let's see, what else did we say stores had? Or did we didn't talk about stores. They have store owner. So I changed my mind. We don't want to store the items for sale inside the store data class directly because that makes it complicated. What we're doing is we're actually linking data here. Now, databases call these things that we're doing here, they call them foreign keys. So here, when we're arranging this, we're saying that a store owner, or that a store has a store owner. Well, store owner is kind of like a different thing, right? So we're going to take the ID of one of these store owners in a different data file, and we're going to say that a store has one of these. The product here product belongs to a specific store, right? In fact, we should probably give this a name as well. Silly me.
Yeah.
Products have names, and then the product has a price, right?
Yes.
And for simplicity's sake,
Quantity.
we're going to assume that the you know what? No, let's not assume that. So product will have a list price, and then it will have a so there's the price that the store charges to customers, and then there's the price that the store can actually buy the product at themselves, right? Do you understand the difference in the things that I just said?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So well, how about call the other one wholesale price, right? So the list price is what is the price that customers can buy it for. The wholesale price is what the store owners can buy it for, right?
Yes. Please, could you give me a minute? I don't know.
Could I give you what?
A minute.
Okay. I actually have to go pretty soon. So
when we're done, then someone has been calling me persistently.
Okay. So yeah, I will just wrap up here then. So with what I've given you here, I would recommend don't go and duplicate this function a lot. We should test it first. The other function should work though. So delete, update, and read. You can go ahead and if you like, I would pick just one. I would do the things that we've done for customers. Try to do the same things that we've done for customers with create, read, and delete, or not create, just read, update, and delete. Try to do the same things that we've done there for customers. Try to do the same thing with store owners. And I would make some example data in the store owners file here. It doesn't matter what, just make up what you like. But if you want homework, that's what I would focus on here. And then in the coming days, we'll build out the rest of the backend scaffolding for all of these things here.
The product should have a quantity, shouldn't it? Like.
So good question. But the answer is the product quantity will be, yes. Actually, you were correct. Add on me. More particularly, different stores might carry the same product, but the product as listed in a specific store has a quantity, right? Yep.
Okay.
Good catch. Good catch.
Cool.
Okay. Well, in that case, we will meet again tomorrow then.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks very much.